Hello, Belinda.
Hi, Omar. It is so wonderful to have some extra guests here today along with Arlene. We have Sofia and Jim from the National Center for the Preservation of Democracy. We just had a fabulous event, our first one of the series this past weekend in LA. How did
It,
it feel?
it was amazing to have this art and talk and KCRW crowd rolling through. And so we're going to reflect a little bit on the experience of this collaboration and then also pull a card for our gratitude blooming community.
So I would love to start with Jim and Arlene. How did it feel to, just have this great experiment of practicing emergence and also holding space for real conversations to happen around empathy and democracy with the plants present?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm so grateful to Sophia and Jim for. I think there was a point where I wasn't really sure if this was going to happen, and so it's really, like, incredible that you had the faith and the belief that we could do this. And so it was. Without you guys, I can't imagine having had this wonderful experience. So yeah, and I have to say, I felt pleasantly surprised. I mean, I myself am an artist, and I was kind of exploring these ideas of, creating like a real. It was like almost like a sculpture for me, but a real object that people could use to explore emotions and their energy. Eventually, for me, it's really a way to reclaim and get back to like our personal power. But what was really surprising to me was tying it into democracy. And so I was really, I feel like it deepened the conversation around democracy. And I really love, Jim, what you were saying about how you really see art as a way of kind of accessing empathy, right? That we can't access otherwise. And that was really interesting to me. So I don't know if there's more that you want to share about how you think this exhibit might have, touched on that a little. I'd be really curious to hear.
Well, I don't, we didn't have a way to really solicit like formal feedback from people. And I don't know if it's something, I don't even know if that's something we necessarily want to explore, kind of let people have that moment. But there was one person, I feel like she may have talked to you, I can't remember, but she actually expressed that when she was in the forgiveness booth, she actually started crying. So, there was something that we did, that you did through the art, that actually activated a somatic response, and that's what empathy does, and the arts do like nothing else can, to create that response where your body just automatically feels something.
When we hold gratitude circles, we always start with 3 intentions. One is that your inner teacher is your best guide. So therefore, number 2, there's no need to fix, save, or advise anyone else. And 3, silence is a participant. And it was so powerful to have these 3 reflection booths, one on wholeness, hope, and forgiveness. And for people to really just tap into their own inner wisdom. I think we were in some ways intentional about not standing right next to the booths and really kind of allowing people to have their own experience. I remember I went back after we had the talk, had the sort of opening, and then we went to dinner, and then I came back. It was, I don't know, maybe 9:00 at night. And because of the music event, there was still people out there. And this woman said, just like, oh, the directions were so clear, and just greet the plant, be present, be aware of whatever emotions come up, and then dare to dream. And then being given the opportunity to write those, whatever came up for them, on this piece of paper that then was strung on the forgiveness booth. And I don't even think most people knew that the paper itself was special in that it had seeds in it that are going to be later planted. But it was just like to really create that sacred. So it almost felt like a confessional booth. And I was like, oh, maybe there was some intentional design, even in confessional booths of like, hey, I just need a little bit of space to be quiet and kind of be able to go within. And it's just how, like, we even just transformed a couple of voting booths from the county voting registrar, right? And people just need a little bit of permission to pause. I feel like that's really kind of what came through this practice, is like gratitude blooming in some ways gives people permission to pause. And whether it's with a card, one of the songs now on the album, and now these reflection booths, is like, what is happening in this pause?
That totally resonates for me, what you shared, Omar, about the pause. I've been sitting with that a lot more since the gathering. And for me, I was kind of holding more of the space around the live experience and just kind of feeling the energy in the air, and us, Jim, Arlene, Omar, and I kind of on the stage, but trying to form this circle of energy to do this collective pause. And I think it's exciting to have our organizations play with coherence. What does it mean to hold a coherent space for people to experience for themselves? Like, what is the story for me right now? What is the story of us? And then what is the story of now, which is really about the collective and the culture that we want to create, and having, a live practice with the curiosity note cards, each of us kind of sitting with a question around each of those things, and then inviting the people that were participating to then do the same. And we did have some time to kind of debrief it with others and kind of check in afterwards. And I think that my reflection is, it is really different to host an event. And I think, Jim, you said this, where there is silence involved, to give space for people to sit with what is going on with me right now. And there were a couple people that surprised themselves in picking up the mic when you walked around the space and sharing. And one woman was like, I'm not the person that raises their hand to share in a public way like this, but I felt moved to and express like kind of some of the edginess around the card that I got. The card that they had gotten was on perspective, and initially it didn't resonate. And it looked like a plant that was a little bit less strong. And then when she did the practice of the agapanthus, of closing her eyes and taking those 3 deep breaths and seeing it again, it was like, oh my gosh, it's actually that what you feel before you want to sing. And that's kind of an expression of your personal power. Back to Arlene, that word. And even as she talked, it was like unfolding. The power of her voice was unfolding. And so I think that's unexpected for people. Like, oh, I'm going to this thing. There's people that are holding space. I'm expecting to listen, but then, to be asked to then be present with your own emotions, and then, the opportunity to express it, I think is really unique. So I'd love to hear, Jim and Sofia, like, you all hold a lot of spaces. You host a lot of people at your center. How did that feel for you? Was there comfort or discomfort around it? It's kind of different.
Well, I think, and I won't speak for Sofia, because I think she has a very unique perspective as well. But for me, there's also the role of host. And I don't know if it's just cultural or the way I was brought up. And Omar, probably, I hope I invited you to some of my famous parties, but maybe I didn't. I've always been sort of like the host, and so I take that role very seriously. And I think part of it is I'm very introverted, and being the host gives me something to do, gives me a reason to interact with people. But there's also that layer of responsibility of like, oh my God, is everybody having a good time? Is everybody getting this? Is everybody like, and with this particular event, is the silence, are the people okay with the silence? Are they like, are they thinking this is just too far out there? Are they really buying into it? So like, there's all these other things kind of bubbling around in my head and bouncing around, just related to the event itself and making sure that people are getting something out of it. So I feel that maybe in some ways it takes me out of the being fully present, but I think it comes somewhat with the territory.
How about for you, Sophia?
Well, this is the first time that we had done an event like this. And, as a host, I think, going off of what Jim says, I think there's always this little grain of uncertainty whether or not folks will be pleased or intrigued and engaged with what you're bringing to the table. And so I think with that, I was allowing myself to step back and kind of enjoy and try to be as much in the moment as possible by allowing folks to have their moment in the space so that I could really appreciate what had come to fruition that day. And I think what was really special about the space, and Omar, you said something that I really liked about such a public space, allowing folks to exercise their vulnerability in such a public yet private manner, such a public space in a private manner, really, I think, challenges how people think about their emotions and how they arise. And I think that it paves way to a larger conversation about how folks can have more autonomy and more control over, not necessarily over how they feel, but how they move through those feelings and how they react and choose to deal with those emotions as they go through their day. Because sometimes feelings may arise throughout the day, and sometimes we don't know why. Other times we do. And I think the power in being able to call upon reflection is that you're able to hold this inner conversation with yourself and ground yourself, and still have, the power and the tools to do that in a very public space.
I love that you're bringing the word vulnerability into the conversation, because I think, we can talk about empathy and democracy and these sort of abstract, sometimes people want to talk about emotions and in a science, this is the neuroscience, and it gives us a little comfort to talk about something that maybe feels uncomfortable. And we're like, democracy, we can be very technical about it, get out the vote, or, how do we get people to participate more? And it's very maybe theoretical. And really, Arlene, I think, evoked it. Both empathy and democracy are really about how do we deal with power. And I think you're really cutting to the chase of it, Sophia, which is to really deal with power, we actually have to acknowledge our vulnerability, right? Because power is inherently oftentimes about trying to acquire and hold on to. Well, if you are trying to just acquire and hold on to, then it's really hard to share, right? It's hard to share emotions and feelings, and it's hard to share resources. And both what vulnerability then invites is how do I share my feelings in a healthy way? How do we share this country, this planet, our resources, each other in a way? And you can't do that without being vulnerable, right? And this is, I think you're cutting to the heart of the struggle, right? Is some people just want to acquire. And what we were trying to invite is no, how do we actually release? How do we open up?
Yeah, I remember at one point at dinner, Jim, you were asking me well, how are we going to do something with democracy with, these conversations? And there was this element of curiosity and kind of excitement, and also questions, how are we going to do this? And what is the connection? What is the through line here? And I really do believe, and especially for me living in a small town in rural California that is, has a variety of political, diversity, when we can see each other as people, which actually takes vulnerability, right? That's what forgiveness is. It's seeing the humanness of someone and being able to give that forgiveness or ask for that forgiveness. And so my greatest hope for this series as it grows is that we can create that kind of real, authentic vulnerability that then invites people from all different spectrums to come and just have the human experience where, we can remember that. And I think that's what's so powerful about nature, is that we are nature, we are part of nature. And so having the plants kind of holding that space, it kind of reminds us of our nature. Omar, you talk a lot about that, like human by nature, right? And so I would be curious to ask the plants today, the cards, is there something that you hope for the next event or this series, or is there something you have a question about that we can, center our card practice around as we are creating coherence together, like creating together?
Anyone have one question or intention for the next empathy and democracy event? This is going to be the second of 4.
I think for me, it is, how do we move the conversation from sort of, I don't want to say general, but I think it was definitely, this first session was like this level set of the conversation, and how do the tools work in general, or how do the tools work for the participants, and then now, and leaning on you guys, how do we use those tools in a very specific way around conversations about empathy and democracy, and how do we get there? What does empathy mean for democracy? Like, what are the themes that arise out of empathy and democracy?
I love that. So Belinda's going to pull up the gratitude blooming card deck, and I don't know, since Jim sort of stated the inquiry, Sophia, would you like to pick the card? There's 7 rows, 6 columns, and Belinda will scroll and you can just tell her to stop.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Let's stop at row 3 and do column 5.
All right. So how do we get more specific? Card number 31, the gardenia, representing the theme of gentleness. Being kind to yourself and others can be a way to show gratitude. What would it look like to live with more gentleness? So just looking at the art first, and this inquiry around how to, move from just level setting of, hey, here are some tools, to how we can maybe be more specific about this connection between empathy and democracy. Is there anything in the art that comes to you, or the theme of gentleness?
When I look at the drawing of the gardenia, I see that there's a lot of empty space within each petal. And I think when I see that, I specifically think of listening and being open to taking in stories and hearing other people, and hearing someone who may be different from you in, small or minute way or a large way, and being able to hold that space for them as you intake that or take that in.
It's beautiful.
You see, if you look at the center, or the very center of Arlene's artwork, there's sort of this swirl to it, and almost like an embrace. So kind of holding yourself and holding others is a way to show gentleness.
I love that, bringing the attention into that swirl, and then Sophia's sort of acknowledgement of the space. And when I look at it with that lens, I kind of see entropy, right? Like this sort of, as things kind of like swirl, they sort of spread out. And entropy can feel like chaos a little bit. And so then I love that. Then how do we be gentle in the face of chaos, right? Like, and I think the reality is that people are messy, right? And so how do we, democracy is messy, emotions are messy. And so what does it look like to be gentle in that space? And so I guess for me, into your inquiry, Jim, around, how do we be more specific? Like, how do we invite a little bit of messiness, like giving people a little safety to acknowledge some of their messiness. And I think this is why, like, the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now is so often, when we start at the end of story of now, we're trying to solve problems, right? And I just was talking to a friend today, Marquis Stillwell, and he said, I don't ever try to solve problems. I just try to change conditions. And I feel like that's part of what we're trying to do, is like, what are the conditions that we're creating? What is the space that we can hold that allows people to really feel they can be gentle with themselves and each other in this conversation about empathy and democracy?
I don't know if this exactly holds true for a gardenia. I know it holds true for a lot of other elements in nature, but I see elements of a Fibonacci sequence or Fibonacci spiral. And so I think of and this is sort of the math side of me instead of the art side, is, a Fibonacci sequence, each number builds upon what came before. And so, I think this idea of like wanting to be at the end and having the whole flower there, for me, is something I need to dial back and just know that it is a building process, and there's a gentleness to that, and that it's okay to not have everything kind of figured out or have the whole picture, but to let the full picture evolve and emerge.
Well, I definitely appreciate how Jim and Sophia, the way that you both are leaning into the unknown around how are we going to connect the dots between this wisdom of the plants, this idea of empathy and democracy, and not trying to like force like a definition just for the sake of having something that sounds clear, but we don't yet know if that really is what we mean, and just embracing the spiral of the unfolding and creating coherence as we move together. That's what I see. It reminds me of the labyrinth on our land. Every time I walk it, I question if I'm going to get to the center, because it just feels like out of control. Like, I know where the center is. I want to just walk there. But every time I have this inner dialogue of, am I really going to get to the center? And I know it's going to happen because, I created the labyrinth, but I still doubt it. And so I just appreciate the way that, even though we all want that so badly, that we're acknowledging the discomfort of like, but we don't know yet how it wants to be, the space. And so what comes up for me is also like, how do we all show up, and how do I want to show up? And, when we were at the nursery picking the flowers that wanted to be a part of the reflection booths, I remember always going to the gardenia and smelling it, because I just love the sweetness of it and the reminder of my grandmother, like the energy of a grandmother, who's just holding you unconditionally with love. And so I guess my question around this is like, what would it look like for us to be in this inquiry in a sweet way versus it feeling hard and challenging? And so I feel like that's maybe a breadcrumb, at least for me. It's like, how do we want to work together? And if we can work together around with an energy of this intentional energy, then can we trust that the ripple effect will be that other people who have a lot of difference can then sit face to face and hear each other and see the humanness in each other? Like, maybe how will that translate? And almost like trusting that it will a bit.
And this runs so like opposite, I think, of where our society is today in terms of, you need to know what the answer is. You need to know what things are going to look like. I'm thinking about just in nonprofit and philanthropic work, when you write a grant, you're supposed to know what the outcome is going to be. And as a funder, I've been guilty of like, well, what is that outcome going to be? Like, focusing so much on the outcome instead of actually focusing on what the process can build. And then same thing with our government. When people run for office, it's, this is my solution to everything. And how can we as a society become comfortable with the journey and not necessarily the outcome?
Yeah, as we, think about pulling a card for the community, I shared some of the reflections, some of the photos with the Zen master Norma Wong, who has been a guest on our podcast before, and she replied, it feels especially important as we overthink our way in this time of fraught and fraying democracy. And, I think that's the challenge, is that we try to overthink things, and we're sort of inviting this spaciousness to feel our way forward. And, just the three of us, Belinda, Arlene, and I, this was in some ways the first time that all kind of three of us got to kind of co-create in our various ways, right? And there was a harmony that was created in that process, and it took time, and so I think part of it is, and then you sort of scale that out to communities, to cities, to states, to governments, like, how do we give ourselves time? And then I go back to like the power of the pause. Like, how do we manage time? We don't manage time by like running faster, right? We manage time by actually pausing, right? And I think that, to me, is the gift that we can kind of give ourselves in this series, is like, what's that special pause that just trusts something to emerge that we might not have been able to imagine from the beginning.
Arlene, what's coming up for you? I've seen you kind of step up to the mic a couple times.
Yeah, well, there's so many things that have come up for this drawing. So, but I feel like three things. I love, Sophia, that silence came up for you. And I really love that, because I had not seen it that way before. But you're right, the petals are very spacious. And the second thing, Jim, it's like, this has always been the spiral flower. And I think, to me, like when you're drawing it, you feel it, so like I felt a spiral when I was actually drawing this flower. I felt it in what I saw, I felt it in what I drew, and hearing you talk about it made me realize that this one is really spiraling outward, right? So it's almost like, there's something in that center that it's holding energy, and it's ready to like just kind of burst outward. So I see it in a different way, I think, just hearing you talk about it. And then the last thing I wanted to say about it is, in the back of my head, I'm like, I remember drawing this plant. And maybe there's a clue here, because I was doing a 100-day project, and this was somewhere in the 70 something days. And I actually got sick, and I had to stop the daily practice. And this was the first flower that I drew when I came back. And I really went into the studio, and I didn't think I was going to be able to finish the project. And this was the drawing, and not just the drawing, but the word gentleness. Gentleness is the way that I was able to, get back to the practice and finish this 100-day project. So maybe there's a clue there, that a little bit of what Omar was saying. It's like, to reach the end, it's counterintuitive. Maybe you don't push harder. Maybe you just really embrace this gentleness in your life.
Oh, I'm so curious what the card we're going to get for our listeners for this week is going to be. So I'm going to start from the bottom up. And then, Jim, why don't you pick the card, since Sophia did the last one? Just let me know when to stop.
Stop. And then that row that we're on right now, the third one.
Card number 37, represented by the chamomile and patience. Some of the most important lessons in life require space and time to grow. What is your relationship with time? How can time be your teacher? as you look at this art, and we'll just briefly, for the community, it's 3 chamomile flowers leaning kind of against each other. Anything come up for folks with this art, the chamomile, and the theme of patience?
When I see these flowers in the artwork, I notice that the center bud, like the face of the flower, is pointed upwards. It's upwards and out, and I think in that patience there lies some optimism, and that what it is that you are seeking or that you hope to arrive to will come.
I think that's a great message for our listeners this week, of just being able to trust some of the optimism that's out there in the world. So thank you.
Mhm.
Anything else, Belinda? Or
Oh, I just love this card. Yeah, it definitely feels connected also to gentleness. And, these were 3 cards that we decided later to include after our first release of the card deck. So courage, patience, and gentleness were a couple of the ones that we added later. And there is a tie-in, right? Like to gentleness and patience. Literally, how do we, be kind to ourselves as we're waiting for things to unfold or the clarity to come, or it's like a family or a constellation of pieces, right? It's not one person dictating what's going to happen for themselves. It's like there's other pieces involved, and of course we have to trust the timing of that with others.
Well, I look forward to seeing how this empathy and democracy talk and pop-up art installation evolves. The next one is going to be October 21st. So if you're in Los Angeles, we'd love to see you there at the Democracy Center, hosted at the Japanese American National Museum. Any final words, Sophia or Jim?
Just grateful that we are on this journey.
Awesome. Well, wishing you all well. Sophia?
Excited to see, pun intended, what this will continue to bloom into.
Awesome. Here's some more blooming.
Cheers.
Cheers.